Okay guys, so I'm currently in a hotel in the middle of nowhere, but I saw this story and I was like, I gotta talk about it. Like, it's so insane. Like, I can't help myself. Shocker, like, felt an urge to ramble about something. But basically what this is it's a report from Bloomberg from Cecilia Dinastasio, and she's a reporter, does a lot of like financial breakdowns and stuff. Also, I swear that sound is the chair. It's just a bad hotel chair. But she did a report breaking down what's going on with Xbox sort of behind the scenes. And she got access to some numbers that as of yet were not public and we didn't know about. But it offers a fascinating little bit of information about Game Pass and potentially its impact on the financials of Activision Blizzard and all of the other businesses associated with Xbox. And maybe, just maybe, it starts to explain, at least in part, why we're seeing a sudden price hike across the board. Because like we said on the stream segment initially about this, their behavior seems desperate. Like, if they were not desperate, they could do a 5% price increase here, a 10% increase there, and they could kind of incrementally get up to the $30 a month price point for Ultimate. And I think a lot of people would just be like, you know, you slowly boil the frog, they don't notice they're being boiled. But instead you see this super sharp spike in price. And I think that that's an indication of like desperation. It's an indication that they realized something or found some data that they really did not like, and they're making a sort of knee-jerk decision to counteract that. But what is this specifically? Well, the article says Microsoft's Xbox division surprised many video game enthusiasts this week when the company announced a 50% price hike to $30 a month for the highest tier of its Game Pass subscription service. The online reaction was swift, with California Governor Gavin Newsom blaming the price increase on Donald Trump's tariffs, and video game retailer GameStop posting a cartoon suggesting players and customers would be better off just buying games in stores once more. The price hike and other changes to Game Pass plans are a sign that Xbox's big streaming push is still not generating the revenue it would like 8 years after launch, according to interviews with 7 current and former Xbox employees. The company is putting some of its top titles on the streaming service, of course, to drive signups and engagement, but that's cutting into sales of higher margin games like Call of Duty, which came with 2023's acquisition of Activision Blizzard Incorporated, said the people who asked not to be identified discussing, confidential internal matters. She continues, Xbox gave up more than $300 million in sales of Call of Duty on console and PC last year, according to one of the former employees, who asked not to be identified, discussing internal estimates. Quote, Game Pass hasn't delivered the explosive growth that Microsoft anticipated post-Activision, and they've realized their infrastructure costs don't align with their pricing model, said Joost van Drunen, the founder of video game analytics firm Aldora. A spokesperson for Xbox declined to comment on this. And this is like the main takeaway. According to the people that they spoke with, they gave up $300 million worth of sales of Call of Duty across console and PC by adding it to Game Pass. That means unless they generated $300 million worth of revenue through Game Pass in that year period from last year's launch to this year's launch, it lost more money than it was worth. It may, even considering that, it may have lost more money than it was worth, because it's not just copies of Call of Duty, which is something I've seen some people, pull. They're like, oh, so 300 million divided by $70 a copy. This is how many copies they lost. That napkin math is maybe sort of close. But one of the other changes that they've made in the last week or so is that they're removing discounts on microtransactions if you have Game Pass Ultimate, which they previously had. It used to be that if you had Game Pass Ultimate, you got like a 10% discount on Call of Duty points or whatever. You got like a faster Battle Pass redemption. I think that worked in Overwatch 2 as well. If you had that Game Pass subscription, you get like increased XP gain for certain heroes, stuff like that. And apparently they're just removing all of that. And I think it's probably because those discounts are bundled into this $300 million loss, and it clearly is not generating the revenue that they wanted. So I have a feeling that probably what's happened is that over the last year, they've been tracking overall spending and seeing where players have gone and where the money has gone while they're subscribed to Game Pass. And I think what they have found quite clearly, call it a hunch, is that people who buy Game Pass, they play the game for a month or two, and a lot of people cancel their membership after that. Or they just have their membership and they don't further spend like crazy. Or they buy the membership and then they use the membership to play other high quality, high expense games for a very cheap price. And it doesn't equate to just buying the game at full price. And it's one of the difficulties of a subscription service model is that it only works as it grows and with scale. And the idea is that with digital goods, yes, somebody who would have bought Call of Duty before, yes, now they can play like Indiana Jones bundled in that same subscription for free because they don't have to pay anything extra for it. But the hope is they wouldn't have played Indiana Jones anyways, so you're just making the tent bigger, you're growing it, and then maybe they buy the DLC for $10 or $20, something they wouldn't have done before because they wouldn't have played that type of game before. And that's like, it's a business model that's largely built on vibes and like gut feelings. No, people will probably like play games they wouldn't normally have played, but I've never seen any clear data that that's what actually happens. And it's the same thing that happened with like Netflix, where Netflix had this entire business model built around, just trying to get players, or rather viewers, to come in and engage with content. And it was never super clear how they were going to justify the crazy expense that they were like accruing while doing all of this. But, eventually they had to adjust it and they had to cut the amount of content and original like TV shows and movies that they were making and streamline it and focus on more budgeted stuff and cancel stuff that wasn't performing very well and get more cutthroat. And I think that that's what's happening with Game Pass as well. Just ultimately, if you're giving up $300 million with one release going to Game Pass, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And now what you're seeing is that, as with all subscription models and recurrent revenue streams, the majority has to subsidize the needs and costs of the minority. And in this case, what that means is that even if you don't play Call of Duty, you have to pay more to cover the losses that Call of Duty incurred by going on the service. And in the same way, like if you don't want Ubisoft Connect Plus games from 10 years ago, you're not gonna play them. Too bad, you need to pay the extra cost to justify that package, because they're just trying to create a library of tons of stuff, most of which like you're only gonna be interested in a tiny, tiny sliver of it, but you have to subsidize everything else. Even the niche stuff that nobody would typically engage with and wouldn't be profitable normally, you have to subsidize that. And it just, I don't personally think it's that sustainable. Clearly, I mean, they're having to significantly raise costs across the board for all of their products, and I think it's only going to continue. I mean, this hiking of the price of the hardware, the price hiking of the subscription models, and they also wanted to hike the price of like their core games going and selling on the AAA side on like Steam with Outer Worlds 2. They wanted to charge $80 for that. Crazy, like it's ridiculous, but that type of behavior has up until now come off as extremely bizarre, and it seemed like it was coming out of nowhere. And as I've said 1,000 times, usually in business, there is a reason why things are happening the way they're happening. If something doesn't make sense in the business world, it's usually because you're missing a piece of the puzzle. And this is that piece, it seems. I think there's other stuff. I think, Satya wants to boost server infrastructure engagement. He wants to justify the $80 billion a year expansions to their server infrastructure, in part by pushing like xCloud and all of that. So I think there's a lot of variables and factors that go into this equation, but quite clearly a $300 million loss on this bet of bringing Call of Duty to Game Pass day one, that's a pretty big oopsie. I mean, that's a big oopsie. I mean, it's not as bad as like some of the PlayStation stuff where like, you buy Bungie for $4 billion and then you just kind of don't get anything for it. So I guess it could be worse, but if their plan is to do this every year, that adds up quick, especially if Call of Duty is growing and more people start to use Game Pass to play it instead of buying it for $70. That math starts to get rough. And I think that's what they're realizing is now the expectation is that it's Game Pass day one. They've communicated that, marketed it. They're kind of in too deep at this point, but every time they launch Call of Duty on Game Pass, they're giving up $300 million. And that doesn't work. That doesn't work. So they have to find ways to make the money up elsewhere. That's why they're frantically raising prices on everything. And so I think that this is a huge component of the equation. There's probably still a couple of other pieces we don't know, but this is definitely a piece of it, a pretty big piece of it. And it makes sense. It's like I said, Usually there's more. If you know, and like you see that stuff just isn't making sense, if you dig a little deeper, you can find out some really interesting stuff. There's other tidbits and interesting info in this article that I think is worth mentioning, at least in passing as well. They say that PlayStation, for example, made up 82% of all sales of Call of Duty Black Ops 6, which kind of makes sense because if you have a PC or an Xbox, it's just way cheaper to sign up for Game Pass for the month that you play it, or even the few months that you play it, and call it good. If you're somebody that like all you play is Call of Duty, yeah, go and buy it and you'll save money in the long run. But certainly I think most people probably just played it through Game Pass, which is where the losses came from and why 80+% were on PlayStation. Beyond that, they also say that subscription revenue was up 16% industry-wide, according to IGN, due in part to customers playing the new Call of Duty game on Game Pass. Some may have paid for a month or two and canceled, unlike the industry's old model where they would have paid $70 and owned the game. And they also mention overall growth of Game Pass as a platform, saying after surging during the pandemic, Game Pass's rate of growth has slowed significantly from 80% between 2020 and 2021 to 36% between 22 and 24, according to numbers released by Xbox. Subscribers were as high as 34 million in February of 2024, the last time the company shared any of the data. So listen, what's the fallout from this? Where does this go? Well, I think pretty clearly they need to make the money make sense, and it doesn't make sense right now. And so they're desperately trying to find a way to make it make sense and to get it working. But, you know, desperation, there's a stink to it. There's a nasty, nasty, pungent odor to desperation, and that's what's all over Xbox right now. Nobody wants to invest in the platform by purchasing games through Xbox, even though I will give them credit. The Play Anywhere feature is genuinely awesome. Being able to buy one copy of the game and play it on xCloud, play it on console and PC, that's genuinely really, really cool. But like, I won't throw a lot of money at it because a lot of people are like, they may not exist in 5 years, which is legitimately a concern at this point, which is crazy because they're owned by a $4 trillion company, but that's just what happens. You know, Game Pass is, I think, a great value in concept and principle, and it has been for a long time, but the shoe is always going to drop. At some point, they were gonna have to start cranking prices to make it make sense. And they're doing that now, and all of a sudden the value proposition is looking a lot less alluring. So the desperation cranks up, they start doing things more rash and more chaotically, customers revolt, and then we end up here. Can't say I'm surprised, but let me know what you think of all of this in the comment section. Genuinely a great article by Bloomberg. Love to see it, and we'll see what, if anything, changes over the next few months. I think the launch of this Call of Duty title is going to be really interesting to see because I think a lot's riding on it for Xbox, more than they would certainly publicly acknowledge. So let me know what you think of all of this. Much love. I'll see you soon on Monday, I guess, for a regular stream. See you then.
He took my thing.